Thank you. My name is Kathy Wolf, and I am a Workforce Engagement Manager in the Southern California region. I've been with the Red Cross for about 14 years, I think, altogether, and been serving in this role or some variation of it for that period of time. So I'm very excited to speak to you guys because it's always exciting for staff services when we have an opportunity to speak with other groups and other activities. We are probably the one activity that touches everyone and every level and every stage of a disaster relief operation. And I was really excited that you wanted to hear more about disaster event-based volunteers and staff relations. Thank you all for having me here. This is very exciting, and great job, you guys, on putting together this entire series. It's really good stuff. So with that, we will get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of staffing on a DRO, how we move to this stage where we start engaging event-based volunteers. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we prepare and how you can prepare, and where our volunteers come from to get an idea of what this workforce looks like and the scope of the people that you'll be working with. And we'll talk a little bit about task-based planning to support that diverse workforce. And we're going to talk about staff requests and get into the event-based volunteer process. And then we're going to talk about staff relations. So there's a couple places within the presentation we're going to pause and you guys can ask some questions. This is a very lively topic. Interaction is always appreciated, so please feel free to jump in, put your questions in the chat, and we'll catch up with you at the Q&A sessions. So the Pacific Division, although we consider this division to be very active in what we call no-notice events, there's many things that we can watch for that help us prepare in advance and keeping an eye on and tapping into the triggers in your area. You're all probably very familiar with these triggers, but there's many things we can do and think through that will make your staffing experience much better. So obviously watch for those red flag warnings and heat warnings and weather alerts, tidal warnings, notices of earthquakes, things like that. At this stage, there's plenty of things you can do to prepare in terms of staffing. You want to make sure you're identifying your activity and functional leads and assign them responsibilities. We want to understand the current COVID-19 protocols and the workforce care plan that will be put in place. Know the tasks that virtual workers can help you with, and know what tasks and activities that you might ask of a disaster event-based volunteer. We're going to talk about that a little bit when it comes to talking about task-based planning, but these are all things you can start thinking about now and start preparing for. And then you want to make sure you've predetermined a call down process to engage your volunteers and what support and methods you're going to use. And understanding the processes for requesting additional staff. All of these things you can learn about and know about in advance. Many of these things are unique to your region and how you operate, how you escalate through an event. But just tap into these things. They're going to be a big help to you very shortly. When we move into a warning event, this is when you're alerting your volunteers or possibly your workforce engagement team is contacting your volunteers for you. Again, we're going to pre-identify our local leadership, maybe create standby teams. You want to start implementing your staff planning and availability collection tools. And always remember to collect availability out for the next 5 to 7 days. One of the biggest stumbling blocks we can run into in the beginning of an operation is you call people to talk about that night shift or the next morning shift. When you're engaging in these type of discussions, make sure you're thinking 5 to 7 days out. It will save a lot of work on the back end. Alert your mutual partners and adjoining chapters that you have something going on. And always be in discussion with your local leadership to understand who's mobilizing that initial wave or those standby teams and making sure everyone understands who and what is ready to move. Always lean forward with an eye on workforce care. This should start at the very, very, very beginning of an operation. And we should start discussing now about mobilizing mutual aid from neighboring chapters if that becomes necessary, community partners, and disaster event-based volunteers. And some of the things we start thinking about very early on is how many people can we mobilize? And how many have been approved? Or do we have approval to mobilize people? Have we thought about lodging, transportation, meals if people are going to be traveling more than 50 miles from their home to serve on your operation? We want to make sure we have mission cards and MPCP cards available, so we have those ready to go. Our staffing team always makes sure we're stocked up on those when something starts. And then what would trigger the activation of the disaster event-based volunteer portal? These are all things we want to lean forward on. Every one of these things will affect the workers' experience on the DR if we get these things right and get them in the right order, and we're thinking about them very, very early. It's important to think about and remember where our volunteers come from. Staff services, when we're filling staff requests, particularly very early on, we're looking at large buckets of volunteers, and they run across this entire spectrum. You may be working with volunteers that are deployed in, and there's some great attributes about that. Although they're not local, they should be able to fill full shifts for you, and they're trained. They're already trained. Your general volunteer workforce are your volunteers you work with every day. They're local. They should be able to fill full shifts, sometimes partial shifts, and we have a way to work with that. And they're trained and they're gapped. Your partner volunteers are local. They may be able to work full and partial shifts, and they may have some training. If you've done training in advance with any of your community partners, they can come to you a little more prepared. Our event-based volunteers are local. They work partial shifts. Sometimes they can work full shifts, but more likely and more often it's a partial shift. And they typically come to us with no training. They're very new. They've just walked in the door as our newest volunteers. Our non-disaster general volunteers, these are volunteers we can pull from other lines of service like SAF or WIC. We can pull volunteers in to support us, and they're very much usually like an event-based volunteer. They're local. They obviously have a previous affiliation with the organization, so they're easy to mobilize. They can work full and partial. They can disaster training. And that's somewhat the same with Red Cross employees. They can also be pulled in. We can use them and pull them in from one of these buckets. They're local. They can typically work full shifts, sometimes partial shifts, and they usually have some training and at least familiarity with the operation. The reason this is important to know is when we are working with staff and staff requests, we want you to think about tasks that need to get done. What do you need to get done? And have a plan. We want you to think about breaking your activity into tasks. Maybe it's custodial or loading and unloading trucks. Maybe you need some data entry support, runners, drivers, couriers, dormitory workers. Whatever it is, when we get into the part of starting to fill out staff requests, always think about you may not get a fully trained gapped volunteer. You may be getting people from any one of those buckets I mentioned before, and we want to find ways we can break the activity into tasks so we can mobilize that workforce. When you're filling out the staff request form, we would need it filled out as completely as you possibly can, but there's plenty of room for comments. If you need things like additional training or someone that has a specific skill, if you're looking for a specific time frame, fill these out, give us as much information as possible. The more detail you can give us, the better chance we're going to have of finding that perfect person to fill that role for you. So now you've done all your pre-planning work, you filled out your staff request, you're looking for workers to come in and assist you. And I get this question a lot. What happens after I submit that staff request, right? Well, there might be a little negotiation with the staffing team if you've asked for 5 service associates, but we wonder if there's tasks that other people could do to fill those roles for you. There may be a little negotiation that takes place. But once that staff request is filled, you'll be notified by the staff services team as soon as the request is filled, and you'll be told who will be arriving and when. We work as quickly as possible to get these staff requests filled, but some can take up to 72 hours to complete. So lean forward, get them in early, and we can work together and very closely to get them filled for you. When staff requests come to staffing, they're prioritized by the operational need based on the objectives and the mission priorities. So some may be a little further down the list, but we're working very quickly to fill the ones that are going to have the most impact and have the most support for the current objectives. So the staff services team will consult with the requesting team when appropriate, and will collaboratively decide if the request will be filled by a Red Cross trained volunteer or an event-based volunteer or another. So when it's determined when event-based volunteers are needed, the DRO director and the Red Cross coordinating officer, the RCCO, will ultimately decide to activate the disaster event-based volunteer plan. And this decision is based on several things. One thing we're always looking at is, have we had a big influx and interest from the community? Are we starting to get new applications coming into the system, to the VPN? And that's telling us that we've got workers out there that want to come and give us a hand. But we're going to make this decision based on a need for additional resources, and quite frankly, to minimize some of the expenses. If we can use a local worker to perform some of these tasks they need, it's far faster, quicker, easier, cheaper to mobilize the workforce from the local area. And it is a direct benefit to the community. When we have people sitting on their couch watching the news and being very anxious about what's happening in their community, by giving people a place to express that generosity of their time and to come out and give us a hand, it is a direct benefit to the community. So this is what it looks like to the volunteer. All event-based volunteers come through Volunteer Connection, and they're directed to redcross.org to fill out an application. There they are received through the volunteer intake process. Then that's when they get their background check. That's when they confirm their email, just like a regular volunteer coming through, a new volunteer. It's going to go through the intake process. Then our local team is going to do a skills assessment and give them a tool where they can start scheduling when they're available for us. And I'll show you that in a minute. And from that tool, the staff services team can then assign them to the DR with all of these things already in place. So disaster event-based volunteers come to us exactly the same process as all new volunteers do, but only in a very compressed time frame. It happens very, very quickly. When they come to us, they come to you, they are background checked, they're screened for special skills and specific skills, and they're registered into this DRO shift tool where they are telling us when they are available. So very early on, the staff services team is going to set up something called a DRO shift tool. And this is a place where the EVBs will be referred to, I guess, through links. And they can look at this calendar and they can plug themselves in and register for shifts. These shifts might look very different on different DRs based on the need. This one is very specific. It's an availability collection tool that we use in one of our counties. But a DRO shift tool is going to look very similar to this and have many shifts built out in 4-hour, 6-hour, maybe 8-hour timeframes. So people can volunteer, come in and fit this work that they would like to do into their schedules. So this is where that tool is, and this is what the staff services team looks at to start assigning people to your staff requests. So there's a lot of benefits to using event-based volunteers. They typically arrive in great numbers and they're a great force multiplier. We can quickly put people to work to fill those tasks and those needs that you have. They have local knowledge. They know their way around. They're familiar with the community. They're connected to the community. They have a very personal attachment to what's going on. They come to us with a diverse set of skills from all walks of life. They're cost effective, as I mentioned before. We can get them on the ground fast. And they're a great opportunity for the Red Cross to recruit for new and long-term volunteers. So in mobilizing a diverse workforce, when we were talking about some of that task-based planning we'd like you to do, these are some ideas of things, new volunteers. And a disaster event-based volunteer is no different than a brand new volunteer who came into your queue the day before the event broke out. So for no training acquired, they can do custodial tasks. They can be couriers and runners. They can be ambassadors. They can be greeters. They can help you hang signs and direct traffic, loading and unloading trucks. With the little guidance, we've been successful with event-based volunteers, getting them into some position where they can help us with data entry or 6409s. They can be dormitory workers. They can work your registration desks. They can be feeding workers. They can help work with unsolicited donation management and disaster assessment, anything that takes a little bit of training. And if more extensive training is needed, please for them to get that as well. And we need to acknowledge the challenges. These are going to be people that really have no previous affiliation with the Red Cross. They may not be quite familiar with some of the processes we use. They're definitely not familiar with how we roll in that way. So they're going to need orientation and job training. They may come to you for short-term assignments only available for a couple hours a day or even a couple hours in one day. Their availability is kind of sporadic and intermittent. They may come to you for a day and you don't see them again for a week, but we work them into the shift tool and they come in and they participate around their own schedule. They're going to require a little more supervision and a little more discussion when it comes to the way things are done, but those are things I'm sure we can get past. Because challenges aside, they're coming. There's no doubt about it. We believe as we move into this next disaster season, we have a compressed workforce, probably less volunteers than we've had in the previous year. So our plan is to mobilize these people and put this process in place very soon and much earlier in an operation than we have in the past. But we know we can be successful if we do some solid planning in advance. We can make this an exceptional experience for everyone.
Kathy, do you have time to take one question?
Of course.
Yes. So Elle is asking, what is the turnaround time for EBVs, the event-based volunteers, from the request time to from you to get approval, and also for someone to go from Red Cross that they registered from redcross.org to that, they'll be able to onboard it and go to the disaster relief operation.
Got it. So let's first talk about that compressed time frame that they come through the queue. We have switches we flip, and we've got all hands on deck coming through doing the background checks. We typically can get those through in about 45 minutes. So and as long as they are there or they're responsive to those first couple emails, we can get them through and on board very quickly. The amount of time it takes from the time you request one to the time you get one totally depends on what we have available in that shift tool. Like I said, we strive to get every staff request filled within 72 hours. It just really depends on what kind of flow we've had, what kind of intake we've had, how many people are sitting in that pool, because from the time we call them and introduce them to what they're going to be doing and call you and let you know that they're arriving, that happens very fast if they're already in the pool. But how quickly we can fill that staff request depends entirely upon what kind of result we have from our recruiting and from whatever arrives in that pool.
Got it. And one more question is that, do we have a form for volunteers who needs their hours verified for retired nurses or anything for their licenses?
Well, I know in our chapter, we definitely do. We provide a letter if that's what they request. We can provide documentation that tells what they did and what times that they served. It's not something that can typically be pulled from Volunteer Connection, depending unless they are assigned to the DR, and we can really track specifics. And if we're logging hours, we can work those things out absolutely one at a time.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier that depending on how they come into the pools and the request time, etc. So do we refer to all volunteers to staff services? What if they're at a remote locations that they're not able to access to us, or they don't have signals to access for redcross.org?
Right. Great question. So it's the only thing we do here in Southern California. Volunteer services is engaged very early on when the pool is starting to build and we're starting to see more applications come through the intake process. We have the options to bring somebody in from volunteer services to help people who might walk in the door on site with computers ready to go to help them do their applications. We've had volunteer services people on standby on the phone if they need to talk somebody through it or fill out the application for them. It all has to get into Volunteer Connection somehow. So whatever support you guys develop within your own region with your volunteer services team and think this stuff through in advance is very, very helpful.
Kathy, we have a great question in the chat. Is that why do we have to? So we mentioned the background checks earlier, that takes 45 minutes, etc. So why is background check important? Why can't we just use the volunteers, use the folks there? Why do they have to go through background checks?
That's a great question. So this is a volunteer services requirement that they come through Volunteer Connection, and that background check is a part of that process. That's a really good question as to why. And it's probably not something I can really answer for you other than they want to be sure that the people are safe. They may have contact with clients, and everyone that has any contact with clients needs to be background checked. It's a volunteer services requirement is probably the best answer I can give you, and it's probably not a very good one. It's something we can definitely reach out and get an answer for.
Thank you. And else, something that I suggest that if they're the communities, I mean, if those are the clients that they were impacted by the disasters, we're more than welcome to use them. As if they're the clients, they don't have to go through the background checks and they're not event-based volunteers. We're more than, I mean, there are a lot of clients that in our shelters that they want to help. And it's also a good way for them to get them involved and to help them to get on track of their recovery process. Okay, we'll stop taking questions now. We'll take questions at a later time. Kathy, go ahead and proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
That's a fantastic point. I'm glad you brought that up. So you're going to be receiving these new volunteers, like any volunteer. Everyone that's sent to you is a Red Cross volunteer. Their background check, like we mentioned, they've had a complete skills assessment done, asking what their skills are, so we can kind of find those perfect fits for them. They've had a high level event orientation completed. They've received information about the event, but not necessarily about the specific job they will be doing. We want to treat them like valued team members. They'll possess a diverse set of skills, but they're going to require a little bit of additional supervision. You should always have a person designated within your activity to receive new volunteers and give them this job orientation. Whenever you're dealing with disaster event-based volunteers, it's a must if you want to manage these people well. So orientation and training, all volunteers are told to expect an orientation about the specific job and task they'll be asked to perform. Safety, of course, is our #1 priority, so let's not glance over that. Be sure that all safety procedures are covered. If advanced training is requested on the staff request, as I mentioned before, and time permits, the volunteer should have already viewed any online supported training. We can direct them to that while they're waiting for their assignment. Any additional job-specific training is the responsibility of the supervisor, but it can be coordinated with staff services when necessary. And there will be times when the event is large enough, if we've assigned a training manager to the operation, that there'll be even more formal advanced training available. And it probably goes without saying that we want to supervise with an eye on retention. There are really very few opportunities in most of our regions to capitalize on this spike of volunteers. We want to be sure that they have a great experience. We want to be sure that they will come back, and they'll come back and see us again. And saying thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope to see you again. Please consider becoming an active Red Cross volunteer. This is a great opportunity for us to pull in people from the community. They get immediately connected to the mission. They have a very high retention rate once we get them in the door. So this is all up to you to make sure that happens. We want to make sure they have an exceptional experience with us. So these were the things we talked about, preparing and where our volunteers come from. And we touched on task-based planning, thinking about the activities that you do and the tasks that can be broken out for virtual and event-based volunteers. And we touched on staff requests and having that information available to us. And we touched on disaster event-based volunteers. So we're going to take a pause so we can answer some questions and see what y'all think. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts. I know this process has evolved very quickly over the last few years. It's becoming more and more refined and more effective. So anything you would like to share, any takeaways or questions before we move on to the next section?
So I've not disabled. I've unmuted you, or you're able to unmute yourself now. We do have a comment from Cheryl that she said there were psychology PhD students at Loma Linda University. They were able to help at a shelter with a huge fire, and the Red Cross process for checking the background, it actually was pretty fast. I do have a question real quick that are we able to request for EBV during our local disasters, or does it have to be hit a certain level of disasters, whether it's division or national?
Well, things have kind of progressed in a really nice direction for us. The division can now issue a DR number at a level 2. So that gives us access to our tools very early on. It's really up to the job director and the RCCO and volunteer services officer when they activate that event-based volunteer portal. And it can be anywhere along the spectrum. I believe we do need a DR number in order to do that so that we have access to our disaster management tools, but those are coming much quicker and much earlier in operations now.
Got it. So we need a DR number in order to request for event-based volunteers. And
we do, but remember that you also have community partners, you have volunteers from other lines of service, you have employees from other lines of service. There's lots of people within the bucket that have gone through Volunteer Connection or already in our system in one manner or another that we can activate very quickly.
Thank you. We have several other questions. Carmela is asking that, so the requester, the person that is asking for event-based volunteers, do they fill out a staff request form and a 6409 labor source request form, or just one staff request form?
Just a staff request form. And you can let us know that an EVB would be a good fit for this position, but we're going to get that staff request and we're going to look across all of those buckets to get that filled for you.
Got it. And does that need a job director's approval? Or can a function that approves it, whether it's assistant director of operations, or does the job director has to approve it?
That can be different on every DR, but since this isn't incurring any expense for us to mobilize an event-based volunteer, it's something that can typically be approved and forwarded to staffing by the activity.
Got it. Thank you. Another question Sandy is asking that, Can event-based volunteers ride as a passenger in a Red Cross vehicle, such as emergency response vehicle, to help serving food or to help distribute emergency supplies?
Absolutely. Remember, they are Red Cross volunteers. They've come through the same process as any volunteer that might have come to you the day before the event broke out. They can ride in cars. They can do everything a regular volunteer can do. They can even rent cars and drive cars.
Perfect. So it will be the same answer that I'm assuming for Linda's question is, how do we identify DEBVs, disaster event-based volunteers? Do they have vest, badges, name tags? She received different responses, whether, how they will be identified. Could you clarify that?
They're going to be identified like any other volunteer. We're going to let you know when you make that request and that staff request has been filled that who's coming, and we're going to let you know that this is an event-based volunteer, but they're going to have the same badging, the same vest as everyone else. The only people you might see that might have different badging or different vests might be partners like CERT teams or people that arrive that we've partnered with to fill those roles.
Thank you. And another question that I have is, how do you request for vests if you're a brand new volunteer or if you're disaster event-based volunteers? Where do you get your vest from?
That entirely depends on your region. We have a supply of them in our region, and we have them at the intake points, and we have them in the staff services team has them. But that is entirely up to your region to put into place.
Thank you. Scott is asking a very good question, as we want to, speed up the process, and etc. Do we want to pre-train our community volunteers so that they can be ready on the go?
Anytime it's possible. We've had some really successful efforts working with some of our faith-based groups and some of our different community service groups, and going in and doing sort of some boot camp training, some very basic Red Cross training on sheltering. Typically it's mass care functions, but anytime you can get ahead of this and have groups of people that may come together and have some knowledge, or better than none, right? Whatever knowledge you can give them is really, really helpful.
Great. This question is also relating to the process of, we mentioned earlier that disaster event-based volunteers, they are just like our regular volunteers. We identify them with the same. So the question is, when they deploy, do they also receive our mission card, our credit card?
We typically do not deploy event-based volunteers outside of the local area. Now, if we were to have, we have a very large region in Southern California. We may have event-based volunteers coming through that want to serve someplace that's more than 50 miles from home. But the way the shift tool is designed, they can only sign up for shifts within 50 miles of where they're geolocated in the system. So we're not typically mobilizing them more than 50 miles away from their home.
So let me ask this then. So, let's say we have a DR, disaster relief operation in SoCal right now, knock on wood. Then, we activated disaster event-based volunteers. They came in. Do they receive any card for any, food, feeding, etc.?
That totally depends on the operation and what's approved. They can, because they are regular volunteers, they can be assigned a mission card. But it just totally depends on what's been approved at the leadership level.
Gotcha. So that will be the assistant director and also the job directors, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So when a disaster event-based volunteers finishes their shift, do they return the ARC vest?
Well, that depends. That's a really good time to have a discussion and say, hey, do you think you're going to be coming back to join us? We would typically like them to return the vest if they are just going to be in and out and they're not going to be returning and they're just there for that event. But it's a good time to have that recruitment discussion.
Okay, we have two comments. One comment is David said, event-based volunteers, they're not able to operate a forklift without further screening. And Doreen is asking, can they serve food without the appropriate safe and food handling training?
No, we would want to make sure that's some of that online training that we would make sure was provided, and then continued training in your job orientation. We would make sure that whatever they're doing, they have the basic training for. So basic food handling would be real important before we send them out to distribute food.
Great.
All right. So you ready to move on to staff relations?
Yes.
Okay. So staff relations has gone through this beautiful transformation over the last couple years, and we've developed, I just want to introduce to you the processes and the complaint form process and how we receive those forms and what happens when you have a staff relations issue on a DRO. Okay. So the vision for mobilizing the power of volunteers from the staff relations standpoint is we want to be the organization of choice for people in groups to come and donate their time and talent with us. And we know that we need to have sound processes in place so people know that they're going to be treated with fairness and treated with confidentiality if and when it's appropriate. We want to be sure we have a process in place that's going to serve everyone's needs. How the workforce complaint process is managed. This is available to you in both steady state and operational state. So in steady state, the process is implemented by the regional volunteer services officer and volunteer relations leads and team members. This is your volunteer services team that's there to help us through any type of conflict or any type of workforce complaints that might come their way during steady state. In operational state, the process is implemented by the staff relations manager, supervisors, and service associates, and together we refer to these people as workforce complaint representatives. Within the staff services structure, the staff relations activity falls under the workforce AD. You may find yourself on a relief operation that doesn't have a specific staff relations person assigned, and that's totally okay because your volunteer services team is standing by and your staffing leadership team can certainly direct you. In a lot of cases, in the very beginning of an operation, we have someone supporting us virtually and helping us stand up that team. So operations have support regardless of their size and regardless if they have a staff relations person specifically assigned. You have channels that you can work through. So you can work with your staff, the staffing lead, and they will get support either from a virtual support system or through volunteer services. Now this form looks a little intimidating, but this is the new workforce complaint form. I will send this out so that you guys can all get a copy of this form if you'd like to keep one handy. But it's found on the exchange, volunteer services, staff relations, they can all provide you a copy of this. And this form is designed to kind of be the starting point for what we call our discovery. So we're going to ask for a lot of information. You can fill out this form just the best you can. Whatever you fill out, a staff relations person is going to receive this form and they're going to reach out to you for more clarification or more details if necessary. So I don't want you to be too intimidated by it. You fill it out the best you can. It's going to ask you some details. And then we're going to use this form to go through and kind of classify and clarify exactly what's going on. Once we receive this form and we do a little bit of discovery on it, we put these complaints into one of four categories. We call this the complaint matrix. So a category one, an issue, is something that we believe the volunteer supervisor can manage. We are going to be there to support that supervisor, maybe with some coaching, maybe to participate in a meeting. But a category one is something that we anticipate the supervisor can resolve with just maybe a little support from that complaint process representative. A category two is going to be an issue that that's a little more severe in performance or behavior, or it may be a complaint about the supervisor themselves. And at this point, the workforce complaint representative is going to get involved and help manage that process to fruition. If we determine that this is a category 3, this is where we're going to get human resources involved to help us manage this. These are things that we consider zero tolerance, things like bullying, discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment. And a category 3, the workforce complaint representative is going to get human resources involved to help them come up with a solution and a resolution. And a category 4 is on the most severe side. These are things that involve fraud, waste, abuse, or criminal activity where we need to get what we call ICE involved. And ICE is the Office of Investigations, Compliance, and Ethics. These are things that will be taken care of immediately, and this team works out of national headquarters. So possible solutions. It may just involve some feedback to leadership or the OM team. What we do as staff relations people is not only work on the complaint or the issue itself, but we're a neat little collection point to be able to see a broader scope of the entire operation. So we look for commonalities. If we have 2 similar complaints or multiple complaints that seem to have the same source, we're looking for that, and we're providing that feedback back to leadership and the OM team to help them resolve whatever it is that could be starting at the top. It could be a flaw in how the operation has been designed, or maybe there's a position that hasn't been filled. Whatever it might be, the solution may be feedback to the leadership and OM team to get a higher level of correction. We may identify that there's further training or coaching that's needed for the responder, or we might find there's further coaching or mentoring needed for the supervisor. Whatever that might be, it could be just a quick conversation and opportunity to coach, and what we want it to be is a learning opportunity. Things could progress to what we call an issue resolution form. This moves into a little more formal process where we're documenting exactly what we expect to be resolved. And a performance improvement plan is another formal type of this, where we're looking at what specific performance, what needs to be improved upon or corrected in a very specific time frame. So we're setting clear expectations in how we expect this performance issue to be resolved. We may end up removing someone from the operation, removing them from the organization, and in some cases, criminal charges are filed. So there's a broad range of resolutions we're looking for. The real key to this is trying to resolve things at the lowest level as early as possible before things escalate, so we can work our way through coaching opportunities and learning opportunities before something escalates. So your tips for engaging staff relations: don't wait. If you're on an operation, and it's always great to have these people in your back pocket from day one. It's great to get to know who they are. Nothing's too small to request a counsel. If you're just not sure what to do, or something just doesn't feel right or look right, you can always just call and have a discussion. Staff relations or someone is always there to coach you and help you with these things. Like I mentioned before, if you don't have a specific staff relations person assigned, you can talk to the staff services manager for guidance. They can certainly tell you and get you right in the right spot. Take advantage of a little coaching for yourself. Don't be afraid to call and say, hey, I'm really not sure how I should proceed with this. What do you think? We can help at every level, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal complaint for us to help. And suggest some coaching when you see there's a need. If you identify that someone could use some coaching, you can let staff relations know, and we can look around and see if there's some other level of support we can give individuals. There's a large team of people cheering on your success. There's lots of people standing by to help resolve these things in any level, in any way. So don't be afraid to reach out to staff relations. It doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be some type of actionable item or something severe that takes place. Early, often, and sooner the better you get staff relations involved, the faster we can get it resolved and move forward. There's some training available. I highly suggest everyone watches the course module number 1. That's an overview of this process that goes into it in much more detail. I would suggest everyone watch that. And now we used to have 3 classes altogether to become a workforce complaint representative, but they've molded 2 and 3 into 1. So now you can view those in Edge and get a little more information on how this works. If you're interested in working in staff relations, talk to your workforce engagement team members in your local region, and they'll help you set up with the training and tell you more about it. All right. Any questions? This is our final question session.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We have 12 minutes left for questions. So I'll give you some time to type in the question in the chat. You can also, raise your hand and unmute yourself later on. I do want to go through the remainder question that we didn't go through earlier. So several questions is, so for the disaster event-based volunteers, do they also have access to Edge?
Yes, absolutely. They are regular volunteers like everyone else.
Perfect. Great. And then we have several comments saying that when John was in event-based volunteers, he did a lot of, things to assist and all those. So the other question is, if an event-based volunteers, if they do decide to extend their assistance, do they simply to go on volunteer connection? Do they talk to someone, or what is that process?
Well, typically, if you identify someone that's interested in remaining, we can contact volunteer services to get an appropriate referral into the department. They can contact volunteer services and the same people they work with to get through the screening process and let them know they're interested in staying on. There is typically a follow-up by volunteer services with all event-based volunteers to ask them how their experience was and if they'd be interested in continuing. So there's lots of avenues, but we want to make sure they get back to volunteer services for at least that initial referral into the department that identifies what they're interested in doing. And then they can come through the traditional onboarding process through workforce engagement.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary Lou. She's saying that we have hundreds of volunteers here in Portland at the Washington School of one of the schools. And when you have enough volunteers and you still have hundreds and thousands of them outside of the door, what is the appropriate process to keep everyone happy?
I assume you're referring to volunteers that walk in, come up to the headquarters, they show up and they want to help, right? Is that what we're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so like I mentioned before, it's really important that the staffing team, the staff services and workforce engagement team is working with volunteer services on what we call our disaster event-based volunteer plan. This is a plan that has been written in collaboration with both departments about how those volunteers are going to flow through the process. I think it's very important that part of that plan includes a way to address this exact question. In Southern California, our front lobby becomes an intake center. We set up a couple workstations where for volunteer services where they have computers. So if someone's coming through the door, we can assist them in getting into volunteer connection and get the process started. And again, you can also have people on standby by phone. You can refer people to their home computers. This is something that the region wants to think through in advance, if that's something that you anticipate in your area. We've had volunteer services go out to a location, to a partner's location, and sign everybody up there. So it's something that the region has to work out between the two departments and put it into their DEVB plan.
Okay, thank you. Kay from Alaska is asking if an EBV gets the same access, assignments, etc., and they're just like one of our regular volunteers. So why are we taking all the trainings that we do versus they're not necessary? They can just take one training and they're just on the go.
Well, they're just like one of your newest volunteers. Again, like if someone had just signed up, no more, no shorter time ago than a couple days before the event broke out, right? We're going to put those people to work, but we're going to give them assignments that are appropriate to their skill sets and their training levels. We have the ability within our region to assign our local volunteers without gaps to assignments as long as we are conscious of making sure they're assignments that are appropriate for their training level. And if they show promise and you'd like them to have a little more training, then I would have them contact staff services. If they've stood up a training department or someone, there will always be someone there that can give them guidance into some online training. But we're not going to walk away from the opportunity to put somebody to work if they don't have a gap, not in our local areas anyway. We want to mobilize everyone we can. So why we take all those trainings is probably a discussion for the training department, but I can tell you that task appropriate things for them to do is the best way to success for your operation. If you've got trained SAs and trained supervisors, you want to put them in those positions that require that level of training.
Thank you. Scott is asking if I do basic orientation and skills enrichment as community volunteers before disaster is there, that any way that I can document, then why local disaster strikes, then they can sign up for EBVs. Runners too. Michael is saying that trash cans don't empty themselves if they just are there to help. Do we have any other questions for staff relations or for EBVs? You're able to unmute if you want. Kay, do you have a question? I saw you unmute for a second.
No, I don't.
Okay. Kathy, do you mind to explain the DOOR real quick? The DOOR, the Door on Volunteer Connection?
Sure.
That's
Sure,
for
absolutely.
supervisors and for the leadership to know what is a door.
Okay, the door. So the mysterious door. The door is where all staff requests are entered. When we get staff requests for a local operation at the beginning of the operation, we put them into the door and we mark them the proximity for recruitment as local. And that keeps those staff requests right with our operation. We're watching for how long it's taking to get those staff requests filled. We're watching for how the event is trending, if it's escalating and we're going to need more volunteers. The next thing we would do is we would reach out to RMS, our divisional support, Susan and her team, and we would start discussing if we had approval to mobilize people that's going to incur an expense to the operation. We might start expanding that recruitment proximity to recruit within the state or within the division or across the country. So the door is where all staff requests are housed for every active operation that's recruiting for volunteers. As a deployment person in staffing, we're watching that door. We're seeing the staff requests that are available to us based on proximity. So we can see if a certain operation is recruiting within the state, within their own division, if it's open to the entire US. And if we're within the proximity that it's recruiting, then we have the ability to click and see the volunteers who have that gap and who are available to deploy. And that's when we engage them and see if they would like to accept that opportunity. So it's where all of the staff requests are housed. And if you don't mind, if I expound upon that a little bit, that's not to be confused with the open staff request page that's in the director's brief in RC View. I get this question a lot because volunteers will go into RC View and they will get to the page and they will see open staff requests and they will call me and say, hey, I want to go to Texas. There's 2 openings for me. And I will have to look at that and say, well, they're only recruiting within the state of Texas. So it's really important if you're looking at that RC View director's brief and you're looking at open staff request and you're looking for opportunities for you or your people to deploy, make sure you're calling staff services or you have a process within your region where they reach out to you, whatever it might be, because what is on that director's brief is not necessarily what's available for us to deploy and to use. So it's kind of an important differentiation. I know as a workforce engagement lead and as a deployment lead, I get this question all the time, and sometimes it creates arguments. So just so you know, what you see in that brief is not necessarily what's available to your local region to fill.
Thank you. So it is very important to look at who is it open to, correct? Whether it's region, whether it's division, or whether it's national.
Yes, and you won't see that on the director's brief. You'll just see the list of open staff requests. It doesn't necessarily differentiate. So whatever process you guys have in place in your region, your deployment specialist will either reach out to you, or if they're open to you reach out to them and looking a little further into something, they can. Some regions have the bandwidth to do that, some do not. So if you have any questions, you can talk with your workforce engagement team and find out how that works within your specific region. I can tell you I get lots of calls as soon as something breaks out and people think that we're all ready to go, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have approval to bring people in from that distance, approval to incur that type of expense to mobilize people by plane and hotel accommodations, et cetera. So just work very closely with your workforce engagement team.